Midday Live, and we're continuing. We're looking at the private-public partnership, that's PPP, and the provision of public infrastructure and services for the Ghanaians has typically been a responsibility of the government of the day. But as the country's population increases and pressure mounts on state resources, government has found it necessary to promulgate the public-private partnership policy, and the policy allows government to leverage public resources with private sector resources and expertise so as to reduce the growing infrastructure deficit. But how has the policy helped in bridging infrastructure gap, and how can private sector make use of the policy to advance its business? With me in the studio this afternoon is the Minister of State in charge of private sector development and public-private partnership, Dr. Rashid Pelpo. Good afternoon, sir.
Oh, good afternoon.
And thanks for your time. But before we even move into this discussion proper, you were supposed to have been on our platform, which is +275 some days ago. We're looking at the WA constituency, and you have some issues with the concerns raised by...
Yes, actually on that day I arrived from Germany. I went for the African Day, which I went to address as a guest of honor for the Africans in the diaspora in Hamburg. And I arrived quite late, and I was supposed to be at the studio, but unfortunately I got here late because of all the things I had to do, put it together before I quickly got here. But I understand the issues they raised, you know, were to give an impression that they could do better. And looking at all the issues that I was monitoring, and I realized that they really didn't have enough grounds, they didn't have enough preparation for them to take over from me as a member of parliament. So I really wish I were there to tell the public that the three who were sitting there debating were actually telling a story about their own failure.
Okay, but you couldn't come in because of the...
It will come to show when
the reasons you're giving.
When the elections are done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's concentrate on why we're here. And this is not the first time we've been speaking about PPP.
Yes.
And you're in charge of that sector. Are you satisfied with what's happening so far when it comes to the level of growth between government and private sector?
Yeah, so far so good. I'm satisfied. The reason being that in the very immediate past, Ghanaians had cause to complain that so much resources were handed over to the private sector to do certain kinds of to provide certain kinds of services to the public. But rather than providing them adequately, the private sector couldn't and took the money, and government had to suffer. So we lost in most of the counts. In coming to the office, I thought, and we thought as a government, that it was important to correct the past mistakes, to make sure there's a policy direction that points at how government will engage with the private sector and how the private sector will reciprocate in what government does to them. And it's all spelled out in the law, and I'm satisfied that now there is a blueprint that is going to come out in the form of a legal frame. But even before that, there is a cabinet-approved policy in how we advance the cause of partnering the private sector in the provision of goods and services.
Now, building on what you've just explained and the bit about the blueprints, when it comes to the issue about even equipment and funding, now let's focus on the government bit, even though you've mentioned early on that there's a blueprint which is available now. There are instances where private sector will do their bit, but government doesn't, especially when it comes to payments, and they're stuck somewhere. How would this bit also be addressed?
Yeah, so with the new arrangement, it's not as if there's going to be a contract which is advanced to the private sector, and you will expect payment. We mostly are interested in a contractual agreement between the private sector and the public sector that allows the private sector person to engage in a certain activity to provide a certain public good, like roads, like a port, like a school building, like a hospital. And because of that agreement, it allows the person to take over the property, the government-owned property or state property, run it for a while, and then make profits out of it before they hand it over. that is the most popular one, the BOT, build, operate, and transfer. We could also ask them to design it, to build it, to operate it, to own it, and transfer to only do a concession, like in the case of ECG that is now being advocated, where you give the whole infrastructure to a concessionaire to manage within a space of time and then hand it over back to government. So these are all PPP arrangements. You know, so in that respect, it is about the private person utilizing its capacity, its efficiency, its equity or resources to invest in a public sector project and then benefiting from that project, which will now allow him to pay off the debt he has invested or the private sector operator has invested in the project.
Now,
in the end, it evens out.
Now, you touched on a bit about energy and PPP. Now, if we're looking at the broader picture, which you've just mentioned, how will PPP affect service delivery? Because you go around, you hear several comments, especially from Ghanaians, the citizenry, and some shared varied views on this issue. How will this affect service delivery in the country?
Well, it is going to be a two-way affair. First of all, we all hate doomsaw. We hate a situation where we don't have lights. Now, if you hand over to a private person, you give him a tax. You sign an agreement and give the private sector a tax. And the tax will be that we want you to deliver 24 hours a day, 24/7. Power delivery to our homes will be 24/7. That's the agreement. And we are going to make sure we pay you 24/7 for each activity you undertake. And so you have to now improve your services. You have to import into the the public sector your efficiency, your drive, in whatever way you can to make sure you meet this expectation.
And failure to do so?
And so if you do so, the aspect of it that might also be of concern to Ghanaians is that they are going to be very, very strict in cutting you off if you don't pay, because they thrive on income. And once, including government institutions, if government institutions are lagging behind, they cut them off. You buy
and
power,
you're confident that will happen?
Definitely, it will happen. This will be a private person, and this private person will not give money to government and sit down and get broke for us to condemn them and say they are doing bad. So it's important that we all prepare ourselves for it. It's not as if there will be too much that you can pay, but that they will be so strict that you can't dodge.
And failure for the private sector to comply with all these things you've mentioned, what happens?
Then they would have breached the law. They would have breached the agreement, the contract. In PPP, there's often and always a contractual agreement between a public sector entity and a private sector entity. And this agreement is adhered to by each of them. Each of them has a responsibility. In the case of government, the responsibility of government will be to agree that you are handing over all the assets and liabilities to the concessionaire, and also to pay for every management practice, every management that they are putting in. Their duty will be to pay for to deliver electricity, to make sure it is fairly distributed, and to make sure that we don't have power cuts.
All right. Thank you very much. I have been speaking with the Minister of State in charge of Private Sector Development and Public-Private Partnership, Dr. Rashid Pelpo.